Chinese warships came within a heartbeat's distance of a U.S. Navy destroyer armed with 96 missiles. Radio transmissions threatened immediate action. Fishing boats were scattered by water cannons. And yet, not a single shot was fired. The standoff didn't end in chaos or battle. Instead, something completely unexpected happened. An ending that left analysts describing it as China's biggest mistake of the year. Why? Because what looked like dominance may have exposed a much deeper weakness. Before we move on, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel and like the video. Why would a ring of rocks and sand beneath the South China Sea almost drag two nuclear powers into confrontation? From the surface, Scarborough Shoal looks like little more than a shallow reef, a scatter of sandbanks barely clearing the waves. Yet beneath that unimpressive image sits one of the most contested maritime flashpoints of the century. The reef sits where the South China Sea narrows into a funnel, pushing ships toward lanes that carry goods worth trillions every year. More than passing freight, those waters feed thousands of small Filipino fishing boats, whose daily survival depends on those shoals, nets heavy with mackerel and tuna. To think of Scarborough only as a piece of real estate is to miss its role as a maritime bottleneck. Tankers cross close by en route from the Middle East to the refineries and cities of Northeast Asia. Container vessels packed with consumer goods sail in the opposite direction toward markets in Europe and America. All of that traffic passes a reef only 124 miles from the Philippine coast. To Manila, Scarborough is not some distant, far-flung outpost, but part of an exclusive economic zone their families depend on. For decades, local fishermen worked those waters freely until Chinese patrol ships arrived with orders to drive them away. The economic stakes are massive. At least 15 million barrels of oil move by tanker every single day through these sea lanes. That's not abstract figures. Imagine entire rivers of crude, kerosene, and gasoline pulsing across the water toward factories, power plants, and airports from Tokyo to Seoul. Cut that off for even a week, and the energy grids of multiple countries would seize up. For shipping companies, insurance premiums spike every time tensions flare. For small villages in Luzon, the impact is far more personal. A single lost season can mean children pulled from school or months of debt as borrowed fuel and damaged nets leave families stranded. But while Scarborough is an artery of commerce and livelihood, it is also a battleground for power. Beijing drew a vast 9-dash line across the South China Sea and claimed almost everything inside it, ignoring overlapping claims from the Philippines, Vietnam, and others. In 2016, an arbitral tribunal convened in The Hague ruled those sweeping claims invalid. International law said the shoal did not belong to China. Yet rather than reevaluate, Beijing dismissed the verdict entirely, labeling it irrelevant, and continued to plant Coast Guard cutters and militia boats in those very waters. Every challenge to that ruling is a reminder of how far raw power can stretch against written law. The human cost of that rejection shows up in scenes far from courtrooms. Filipino boats swarmed by high-pressure water cannons, crews clinging to their decks as their small outriggers rolled in the waves. Surveillance photos show fishing craft scattered like debris, while just over the horizon, foreign destroyers held their positions. For the fishermen, the clash isn't about maps, but about whether they will bring home catch or be forced back to empty nets. That is why Scarborough is more than a cluster of reefs. It is a place where the Philippines' fragile food security meets China's expanding shadow, and where the global economy runs directly into geopolitical ambition. A symbolic test of sovereignty, yes, but also a pressure point that keeps trade ships moving and coastlines fed. Nations risk conflict here, not because of sand, but because this reef embodies the collision of livelihoods, energy, and law. Now that we understand the stakes around Scarborough, the question becomes what happened when a U.S. destroyer sailed straight into those contested waters and met China head-on. The USS Higgins steamed into Scarborough Shoal waters, carrying the full armament of a modern guided missile destroyer, nearly 100 missiles ready in its vertical launch cells. But the real contest wasn't measured in explosive power. It came down to whether the ship could hold its ground under intense pressure without firing a single shot. This was part of a freedom of navigation operation. a calculated maneuver designed to demonstrate that no country could unilaterally close off international waters. The Higgins kept its bow pointed steady, its engines humming at the same knots, its wake cutting a straight line across contested seas. On the bridge, officers monitored instruments and confirmed navigation points. For them, victory meant staying exactly on course, even as threats closed in. The first shadows appeared on radar before human eyes could see them. Chinese warships maneuvered into the shoal, with their transponders silent, slipping into a tightening perimeter around the American ship. At 500 yards, the danger became clear. That was well inside safe maneuvering distance for vessels of that size, and every sailor understood that one miscalculation could trigger a collision. Still, the Higgins pressed ahead. Orders repeated calmly: hold course, maintain speed. Then came the radio calls. A voice in accented English warned the U.S. destroyer to leave immediately or face serious consequences. Each transmission grew sharper, but no reply answered back, beyond a short acknowledgement. On the American bridge, the SPY-1D radar system lit up with contacts as if the screen were a dense storm of echoes. Dozens of patrol boats, trawlers, and Coast Guard cutters filled the picture, every blip representing a potential hazard. The system could track hundreds simultaneously, and operators guided their cursors carefully, tagging those that moved most aggressively toward the ship's path. While the American crew stood silent, the Chinese captains surged their vessels forward. Hulls churned high waves as cutters angled dangerously close to the destroyer's flanks. Sailors on deck stood at stations, hands on equipment, eyes fixed on the encroaching threat. At just 300 yards, the Chinese ships reached what naval officers sometimes call a heartbeat apart. That is the distance where neither side has space to maneuver without brushing paint, where a slight rudder turn or unexpected swell could scrape steel against steel. The atmosphere was tense, but commands did not change. Higgins's helm stayed steady. Beyond the warships, another drama unfolded. Filipino fishermen who had ventured toward the shoal that very morning found themselves under attack from high-pressure water cannons fired from Chinese Coast Guard cutters. Their wooden boats, some barely outfitted with engines, heaved in the waves as streams cut across their decks. Nets scattered, and crews hung on to prevent capsizes. Where they once fished freely, they now drifted at the mercy of foreign patrols, their livelihoods treated like pawns in the broader struggle. The American destroyer saw the tactics firsthand, its powerful radar and lookouts recording both the harassment and the competing naval maneuvers. As the Chinese ships pressed closer, sailors braced for orders that never came. Missile covers remained sealed, gun mounts stood quiet. Restraint was not a sign of weakness, but the very tool of strategy. In choosing silence and steadiness, the Higgins left Chinese commanders with no provocation to fire, yet exposed their aggressive moves before the eyes of the international community. Analysts looking back called it an unforced error by Beijing. Instead of forcing Washington's hand, China revealed both the limits of their intimidation and the willingness of the U.S. Navy to call their bluff by doing absolutely nothing beyond navigating in a straight line. What seemed like the perfect recipe for catastrophe ended with the opposite outcome. The destroyer's silence became its loudest weapon. In those contested waters, restraint spoke more forcefully than firepower. It showed the world that discipline, not missiles, could shift the balance. Scarborough remains unstable, a point where fishermen, fleets, and national pride all collide. Any mistake here could reset the balance of peace across Asia. That's why these flashpoints matter. They aren't only about ships crossing paths, but about the rules deciding who commands the seas. Which kind of strength do you think actually secures the future?